Welcome back to the Vandy 24/7 podcast. I'm Joey Dwyer here with Brandon Bigsby. In the midst of our big move, Brandon, tell us your excitement level for the move to 24/7. Obviously, we've pumped a lot of coverage out. This is your first podcast as a member of 24/7 Sports. How does it feel?
Man, it feels great. I mean, honestly, this whole partnership has been so exciting to kind of see really come together and to be a part of. Obviously, Joey, you and I are familiar with each other and the whole team with Chris and Billy and Elena as well. But to be able to join Robbie, who has done really outstanding coverage for a long time for Vandy 24/7, and to kind of really join forces with, I mean, really two of the high end and more high profile beats really for Vanderbilt athletics coverage is really awesome. So, really excited to see what's going to happen over these next few months. And I think there's going to be a lot of success out of this, Joey. Happy to be a part of this transition with you guys. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So, shout out to 24/7 Sports. It's been an absolute blast to be a part of so far.
For sure. Before we get into basketball, we've got a lot of content on the site. Put out a feature on Chris Freeman, the Vandy PA guy, this morning. We'll go through it. Justin Angel posted a exclusive with Isaiah Glass. I wrote a big feature about the football transfer class. You have Elena's feature on Michaela Blake's, a basketball column for me. A sit down with Tim Corbin. A lot of content there and a lot that's going to be coming over the next few days. So, Brandon, we're going to be rolling, but let's get into basketball. Vanderbilt basketball also rolling 12 and 1, ranked 31st in the net, which is the best net ranking in program history to this point by essentially a long shot. And you enter SEC play and you know it's going to be a gauntlet, but I guess you got to feel pretty good about where they're at heading into it, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you had told anyone earlier in the year that Vanderbilt would be heading into SEC play with just one loss, I think that not only would they take it, but they would probably even be a little bit surprised, Joey. I mean, we kind of looked through the non-conference schedule before the season started, and there were some games you kind of felt like, okay, that might be one they drop. I mean, the Nevada game was one that I think really sticks out. We didn't really notice Seton Hall was going to be as much of a struggle as they have been, but you thought that could maybe be a tougher game than what it was. TCU is another game that felt like a bit of a toss up. Cal earlier in the year felt like a game that could be close. So really, that feels like the 3 or 4 games to where Vanderbilt really has set themselves well and has put themselves in position to really be in the tournament conversation. I mean, Joe, you look at Joe Lunardi's bracketology, and Vanderbilt's one of the last 4 teams in the bracket right now, according to
Hmm.
him. I can't remember the last time I've seen that this early in the season for this program. So, considering that this is a team that has the third toughest schedule in the country from this point forward, you got to feel like if Vanderbilt can at least knock in 6 wins, an 18-win regular season, with how tough this conference is in the SEC, that could very well be enough to put them into the tournament field. So I think that Mark Byington and this team have set themselves up really well. I think they have a lot of players that have really stepped up and have contributed well, some even to a surprising extent. I think that Vanderbilt should be really happy about where they are. And again, if you hit 6 wins, I think you're looking really good to be probably undoubtedly into the NCAA tournament field come March.
For sure. Mark Byington said it a few nights ago. He said, they do what they're supposed to do in non-conference. We put ourselves in a position to have a chance in SEC play. The big goal is the NCAA tournament. We don't hide from that. We talk about winning right away. And Brandon, he said a long time ago that he wasn't rebuilding. And my column on 24/7 is essentially the bar has been raised. Mark Byington came in here with a program that had very little expectation of going to the NCAA tournament, and now you're going to be playing meaningful games, and the NCAA tournament not getting there would be kind of a disappointment for this program. And I think we got to talk about what it'll have to look like the rest of the way. You mentioned it a little bit, but 12 and 1, pretty high in the net. They were the 16th most efficient team in the country in November. They're playing really good basketball right now, especially over the last couple of games. A bye game on West End had not felt like that over the last few years, and starting to feel like that. But you mentioned the schedule was a lot more difficult. They played the 346th best schedule in the country via Ken Palm up to this point. Brandon, there's not many more teams than 346, so they're obviously pretty low in that ranking or high. I never know how to say the Ken Palm rankings. Is it high if it's a low number or whatever? But point being, they have the third hardest remaining schedule in the country based off whatever metric ESPN uses, and they run a complete gauntlet after the first 4 games. The first 4 is LSU It's Mississippi State, South Carolina is the fourth game, and the third game's Missouri. Brandon, that's a really tough schedule in itself. And then you go and you play Kentucky, you play Florida, you play Alabama, teams along those lines. I think the good thing for them, like we've kind of mentioned, they have set themselves up to where they don't have to pull a cat out of their hat like a Stackhouse team did, and actually was successful doing at times. But now they just have to kind of sit around 500, and you got yourself a shot. The best thing about their resume right now is they have no bad losses, and I think that's really going to help them because even a lot of SEC teams who are on the bubble have bad losses. Mississippi State's had a few over the years. Vandy had one 2 years ago or 2 years ago. Brandon, that's a big thing going for them right now, and I think that's going to influence what they have to do the rest of the way as well. And that's something that really has not been talked about to this point.
Yeah, I agree with you, Joey. And I think another thing that is really interesting about this too is that not only do they not have any bad losses in non-conference play, but with how tough the SEC is, there's not really an opportunity to get a bad loss, as
Mhm.
wild as that sounds. I mean, every single team in the conference has 10 plus wins. The worst record in this conference right now is 10-3, which is South Carolina. So there's really not an opportunity for Vanderbilt to really take a bad loss. The only losses that they can really take are going to be either against teams that are firmly in the field, and it won't be viewed as a bad loss. If anything, if they're competitive, it could be viewed as a good loss if that's something that you believe in, or it's a loss to a team that they are jockeying with that they're kind of comparative to. So there's really not an opportunity for Vanderbilt to really tank their resume, and there's also not an opportunity for them to tank their net ranking at all because not only do they not have bad losses, but all of their wins were convincing in the games they needed to win convincingly. I mean, I feel like we talked about this on multiple occasions, Joey, during the non-conference slate, but over the last couple of years, it felt like a staple for Vanderbilt teams to not win these bye games as convincingly as they should. I mean, you feel like a game like Austin P would have been, instead of a 30-point win, it would have been maybe a 10 to 15-point win, or a game earlier in the year like SEMO or UMES. Like those are the games that it felt like Vanderbilt played very, very closely. And I think you go back to a couple of years ago and say that their struggles winning those bye games convincingly probably is the reason they didn't make the NCAA tournament in 22-23. So considering that this Vanderbilt team did that, they set themselves up really well. And again, now they're in a situation where if you get 6 wins or more, I think that they should be pretty comfortably in the field. It'll probably be a conversation, but depending on who those wins are against, they've set themselves really up well. And I think that they probably have more comfort level with their resume than a lot of these other bubble teams that they're probably going to be fighting with in a month or two.
Yeah, my dog was going nuts, which is why I was muted if you don't mind. But I
No
think
worries.
it is an interesting case to think about what it has to look like come Selection Sunday for them. Six is an interesting number. I think I might go a little higher and say seven. Ken Palm's got him at 7-11 in the league right now if things were to end kind of as they are right now. But I think that could put him in the conversation and maybe even get him in. I think a lot of it depends on who they're beating too, because if their wins are all the teams they're supposed to beat, they are probably going to be around the low 40s to mid 50s in the net, and that's fine, but not necessarily something that's going to help them. But if they go and beat a Tennessee at Thompson Bowling, or they go beat Kentucky at Rupp or something along those lines, then I think that makes it look a lot better. And again, it's kind of the thing of like we've talked about in the past. Well, is it better to beat Tennessee and lose to the last place team, or is it better to just win all the games you're supposed to? Now I think either case works really well for you. And I think you look at kind of comparable resumes. Michigan got in with 17 wins, I think 2 years ago. So they're kind of setting the precedent there of like win total doesn't necessarily matter. It's who you beat and where you beat them and how much you beat them by. And Vanderbilt has beaten four Power Five teams to this point. It's beaten everybody by a ton of points. Now it's got to take care of some business, though. We talk a lot about how they've set themselves up. They haven't set themselves up to get in with 3 or 4 wins. They've set themselves up to be comfortable if they're in the middle, but they've still got to do it, Brandon. And I think this is where we kind of get into the on-floor product. We talked about resume and things along those lines a lot, but Brandon, what are you seeing from this team that is encouraging to you? What are you seeing that is making you a little worried. I think it's weird because we talk about this team who's 12-1, who's got a great resume, and we still talk about, man, they've got some things they need to work through. There's some guys that they've got to have play better basketball, and I've tried not to be too negative in those ways, but you ask, and there's a lot that you kind of worry about. So, what are you seeing from this team right now that's encouraging you? What are you seeing that you're maybe a little worried about when they run the gauntlet?
I do want to say one thing to kind of bookend that last point too, Joey. Something that is going to be key with Vanderbilt to remember too is that they played both Kentucky and Tennessee twice. So that is two opportunities for them to potentially get that marquee win that you were talking about. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. But as you mentioned, like this is a Vanderbilt team that as good as they have looked in a lot of their games, I feel like definitely still has had some area to improve. I think Mark Byington has been one of the more vocal ones about that, saying that there's still some things he wants to see cleaned up. I think the number one thing, and this is something that you kind of wonder maybe if it does increase in the SEC play or if this is where this team is, I feel like the 3-point shooting is definitely a little bit of concern. Just 33.5%. That's fourth worst in the SEC coming into SEC play. And it's a team that, it's not from a lack of trying. They shoot 26 threes a game. So it's not that they aren't taking them, they just are missing them. They just aren't getting those shots to go. And I do feel like the shot selection has been a little bit better than what we saw earlier in the season. I think Vanderbilt isn't forcing as many shots. I think they've been a little bit more selective and have been looking for that extra pass and looking for that crisper play rather than just going for that first kind of semi-open look that they're seeing. But I do think that the shooting is still something that can be a little bit of a concern. I think really the number one concern that I have for this team is what is it going to look like on the interior? I think that if there is one weakness about this Vanderbilt team that we haven't really seen show up too many times yet in non-conference, a part of that has to do with the teams they played, but I think really is going to show potentially in the SEC is the interior presence. Obviously, losing Johnny Wright was a very big loss for them. Jalen Carey is someone that has really, really struggled out of the gate, and I think that they expected to kind of do a little bit more at that five spot, even though he has had a little bit more of responsibility weighted on his shoulders than what they maybe anticipated coming into the season. But we just don't really know how it's going to look with Devin McLaughlin at the five in SEC play in a conference that for so long has been dominated by these long, lengthy bigs inside that can crash and disrupt so much and go in and grab rebounds. It just feels like that is the one spot on this Vanderbilt team that they really don't have anything that can match up with that with any other team. They're definitely probably the most undersized team in the conference. And as much as I like Devin McLaughlin, it's not a shot at him. He has been absolutely stellar. I think he's arguably Vanderbilt's most important player. You can probably say either him or Jason Edwards, but just because of the role he plays, I think he has that same conversation. I just don't know how that's going to work against SEC teams to where pretty much night in, night out, you are facing a center that is 6'10 and up, a lot of body weight, a lot of strength inside, and multiple guys that have that same role that can really step in and kind of lock in the interior. So those are probably the two things I would say I'm most concerned of with Vanderbilt heading into this SEC slate.
Yeah, I'll start with the front court. I think that's one of the things you got to look at, right? They were out rebounded in three of their four games against Power Five teams, six of their 12 or 13 non-conference games. A lot of those were obviously Power Five teams, but then you throw in three bye game teams there too. So you've got a lot to worry about in that front court, I think, still. And I think we talked about the most important player probably being Devin McLaughlin. I think the X factor for them, and I said it was Tyler Nickel yesterday, and I'll explain why I said that. The second guy I would have in that conversation would be Jalen Carey. They have really expected a lot from him, and I think he's shown real spurts of playing well, but he has all the tools and hasn't quite put it together yet. He hasn't made shots from the perimeter, which I think is something they were a little surprised by. I think his passing hasn't been as great as you maybe would have hoped. But the bigger thing is he's just got to get presence inside. He's got to rebound. And I think the thing that they've done well recently is they've had their guards rebound a little bit better. And that's something that's going to be a recipe for them too. Rebounding is not a one position matchup. Oftentimes the leading rebounder is the five, but sometimes it's AJ Hoggard going and getting 4 or 5 rebounds that makes the difference. Sometimes it's Tyler Nickel grabbing 6 that makes the difference. And early on, I thought they did a really poor job of that, but I think they're starting to be a little bit more fundamentally sound rebounding, and I think their guards are starting to crash a little more, which is obviously something to note. But I'm worried about their interior, Brandon, especially with their depth, because Dortch yesterday told us uh, he thinks in the SEC for a long time you've needed to have four bigs who could get out there, and you could have 20 fouls combined. To put that in perspective, Vanderbilt's got about 10 fouls, and J.Q. Roberts, I think, he's an option. I don't know that he's a guy I want playing the five. I think he's more of a natural four. And if J.Q. Roberts is playing the five against Janai Broom, I think you're in some trouble there. Vanderbilt was really mismatched in the front court last year, and it didn't show up night in, night out like it maybe would have while Liam Robbins was out 2 years ago. But man, I am a little worried about not only their rebounding, but just more so defensively. They don't have a shot blocker down there because Johnny Wright was their best shot blocker, and he's out. I think that's the position they've got to really address in the transfer portal this offseason. Even if Kajani Wright's able to go next year, I don't expect him to be back this year, but man, that's my number one worry, and I think the shooting, like you mentioned, is also a worry. I do have a stat though that I think Vanderbilt fans will like that will maybe make them more encouraged. Here we go, Brandon. Apparently, I'm a big stat guy now. This is like the most stats I've ever rattled off in a podcast. Vanderbilt has shot over 40% as a team from deep in each of the past three games, and have hit the 400 or the 40% clip 5 times on the season. Obviously, take the quality of opponent in there. I think they're getting a lot more open shots than they have in the past, but they're finally going in. The first three games they weren't. After starting slow from three in the first three games of the season, which was 21.4% total, Vanderbilt has shot 37.5% as a team in the last 10 games. They shot 39.5% beyond the arc in December. Brandon, that's a stat worth noting. Obviously, the competition is going to get much more difficult. There's going to be a lot less open shots. And I do think that there's something to be said for guys' career averages because I think they're just an okay shooting team. Shooting average wise, they're shooting 33% as a team. And that's kind of what I expected them to be at, maybe 35, 37, maybe. But I don't expect that number to go up a ton, but it is worth noting they're getting better shots now, like you said, and they're starting to make them a little more. I think another thing too that I'm a little worried about is it's sometimes the lack of production that AJ Hoggard and Tyler Nickel have given them. I think Hoggard at times has been inconsistent. And I think they really have another gear if Tyler Nickel can play the basketball that he's played the last three games where he scored in double figures. That's a guy who I think they're going to live and die with at times. Edwards is going to be the go-to guy. But can Hogard and can Nickel pick up the slack a little bit? That's something that I've kind of been worried about since the first week because I don't know that either of those guys have quite done what I think they're capable of doing. And maybe that's the positive here is those guys have more basketball ahead of them and are capable of doing more things the rest of the way. But Brandon, those are kind of the three worries I have. I think a lot of that also is offset with their lack of turnovers, which I wonder if that keeps up in SEC play. I think it probably will, considering Hogard and Huffman and Tanner are all guys who never turn it over. Tanner literally has never turned it over, but I guess I wouldn't say Hogard's necessarily a never turn it over guy. Tanner and Huffman are more so that, but they've had more possessions for themselves. So when the offensive rebounds don't come or they're giving up offensive rebounds. They're still getting enough possessions to win the game, and that's going to be a help for them. But Brandon, the three things, like we mentioned, the shooting, the rebounding, and can somebody step up that's not Jason Edwards? Jason Edwards has been a bona fide star, and so is his former AU teammate Devin McLaughlin. But they need more, and Devin McLaughlin's been good. I'd expect a little regression, not a ton. But Brandon, I'm a little worried about those three things. I think there's a lot of positives though, and I'm gonna swing it to you for that.
Yeah, and I think someone else that really has the potential to step up, Joe, and we've seen him, kind of contribute on the defensive side more, but I think there's still a lot more to give from MJ Collins as well. I mean, you kind of look at the stats between him and Tyler Nickel, and Tyler Nickel obviously plays a little bit more than MJ Collins, averages about 2 more minutes per game, but really their stats are pretty much dead even for the most part. Both are at the exact same field goal percentage of 42.5%. Nichols 37% from three, and Jay Collins is 33. So, I
Mhm.
mean, really, they're pretty even. And I think the one thing with MJ Collins is that he brings you something else Defensively, I feel like the Tyler Nickel maybe doesn't. Not that Tyler Nickel is a bad defender, but I genuinely think that MJ Collins, when he is on, is arguably one of Vanderbilt's best defenders, especially on the perimeter. And we've seen him have games where he can really step up and contribute. The Nevada game sticks out. Obviously, the Virginia Tech game, his revenge tour game, as you could maybe call it, he was a massive reason they were able to go to Blacksburg and win that game. So I think he is somebody that really could step up. But I think the thing too, Joey, that you feel like as you talk about some of the positives is that you do have a lot of depth on this team. And that's something that Mark Byington has raved about really from the start is how deep this Vanderbilt team can go. I mean, sure, there might be a night where Tyler Nickel or AJ Hogarth maybe aren't on, but you know that you have a guy like Tyler Tanner that can step up and give you minutes, MJ Collins that can step up and give you minutes. And honestly, I feel like the most underrated player on this team by pretty much everyone outside of that building. Chris Magnon, who has really stepped up and been kind of a glue guy that really has bought into his role and kind of does a little bit of everything. His stats don't necessarily pop out to you. He only averages like I think around 15 minutes per game. He has about 5 points per game, about 3.5 rebounds per game. But he's so efficient on both ends of the floor when he's out there. It feels like he's always making a play on both sides of the ball. He's someone that I think really could make a difference in terms of just some of the little plays that don't necessarily get shown on the stat sheet, going for loose balls, finding his way to disrupt plays on the defensive end, getting his open in the spots and either taking that shot or getting that breakaway dunk or setting his teammate up as well with trying to create some of that separation. So I think he's someone that has really impressed me and could very well be an SEC play, but I think that depth is the number one strength of this Vanderbilt team outside of their front court, as you mentioned. There's just so many guys at that guard spot, really 1 through 3. They can kind of rotate and on night to night basis say, this guy can give me a few points, that guy can give me a few possessions. And that adds up. You might not have a Jason Edwards 20 plus point night every night, but if you have other guys that can give you around 5 to 10, that makes up for a lot of that. And I think the Vanderbilt has multiple guys that can step up and do that on a nightly basis.
Yeah, that's a real calling card of this team. And I think along those lines, they have a lot of old guys too who know how to play and have learned how to play together as well. You look at the New Orleans game, I thought there was a lot of good free-flowing offense in that play. Or in that game, there's a play I tweeted where AJ Hogarth drove it to the top of the key and then Jalen Carey kind of cleared out the lane for a Tyler Nickel cut. That didn't look like a set to me. That kind of looked like just what was happening based off their instincts. And I think that's a real thing to look at this point too. They are learning how to play with each other. I think they know how to win. They haven't been in a ton of late game, possession game type scenarios, but they beat Nevada. They've won on the road. I think this is a group that doesn't necessarily shy away from those type of moments. I think they have a lot of guys who are built to make plays late in the game. I think I remember the secret scrimmage. There was a play late in the game that kind of killed them against Clemson. But Brandon, the only time we can point to them having a late game catastrophe was a secret scrimmage, and I think that's something that uh, really helps you at this point. They don't turn it over. I think they're starting to take better shots. They're balanced. They've got a lot of depth, and I think something we haven't talked about too is they have a willingness to defend that I don't think we've seen from a Vanderbilt team in a couple of years. Stack tried to build in a defensive identity, but over the last few years of his tenure, especially, you didn't necessarily see that show up. And I think you're really starting to see that with this team. They don't have the best athletes. They don't have the best guys who are from top to bottom good defenders. I think Collins is a really good defender. But even the guys who aren't great defenders, I think, are willing to. And I think that's a big thing, and also a reflection on what Mark Byington has done. This team looks really well coached at this point, Brandon. That's probably the biggest positive that I've seen from them. It doesn't necessarily matter what happens this year in terms of how we view Mark Byington. I think we know that we think he is the guy for this job at its current moment. But as you look forward, you continue to think that just based off the results they've had so far, the way they've scheduled, he's doing everything right now. And I think that is a real testament to what Candace Story Lee did in that search. And I'm not sure we thought we would be saying that at this point of year one, is that he's doing literally everything right. But I don't see much wrong in what Mark Byington has done at this point. His team's coming together. He's scheduled well. Maybe didn't schedule super strong, but he scheduled enough to get them high in the metrics. They've won by a lot of points. They've been ready to play every night. Brandon, I think this is a real positive, just in terms of the outlook of the program long term is what you've seen so far.
Yeah, and there were a lot of unique challenges with Vanderbilt that, coming into the scheduling process, he kind of talked about saying, when he came in, there wasn't a game on the schedule that they had locked in. And it's kind of hard to craft and conduct that schedule when you don't really know what your roster is going to look like. There were so many transfers that came in. I mean, outside of Tyler Nickel and MJ Collins, no one really on this team had played Division I basketball together. I know Jason Edwards and Devin McLaughlin were AAU teammates at the time, but it's kind of hard to ask them to carry that over four
Hmm.
or 5+ years later. So, this is a team that didn't really have a lot of chemistry together outside of those two pairs. And, Mark Byington really had a bit of a difficult challenge trying to get that schedule together. And I think he did a good job. I think that maybe they expected teams like TCU to be a little bit better. Some of the teams in the Charleston Classic, I think, like a Seton Hall, like a Nevada, to maybe look a little bit more convincing than they have. But Nevada's still a very good win against a team that is still going to be in the tournament talk to this point. So I think that even though they maybe didn't schedule, extremely strong, I think they scheduled very smart. And the old expression, sometimes you have to work smarter, not harder. I think that's kind of what Mark Byington and the staff did. Sure, it might not be a gauntlet of a schedule, but I think that went to Vanderbilt's advantage. They're still one of the top teams in the country in the net. They still have an opportunity to improve that net ranking even further, depending on how this SEC schedule goes. And they ended up being 12-1 while being in that high end tier of the net conversation with a ton of quad one opportunities still remaining. So I think that just the way that Mark Byington has ran this program has been pretty much impeccable at this point. And Joey, something else to kind of put a bow on that point. Something we talked about before the season is how Vanderbilt, especially when we talked about recruiting, kind of had to pay the tax of Vanderbilt has been bad for the last 8 years. And it feels like already the perception of this team and the perception of this program has completely flipped in a 2 month span. I mean, genuinely, I think that when people see this program right now, they see it as a up and coming team, not just locally, but on a national level as well. They see Vanderbilt as a team that maybe could be in the tournament conversation, and they see Vanderbilt as a team that, if they keep going on this track in a couple of years, could be a team that we're not even talking about being in the bubble conversation, but has themselves in a situation where they're like, okay, they should be well in the tournament by now. It's just a matter of what seeding are they going to get. So I think that just the way that this program is viewed has completely changed compared to how people viewed this program even just 3 months ago before the season started. Give Mark Byington and his staff a ton of credit. And as you mentioned, Candace Story Lee, give her a lot of credit for identifying Mark Byington and making that hire, because I don't think anyone expected this thing to flip on the way it has so quickly. I think people thought it could, but it's been so immediate and so visual how much the program and how much the way this program is perceived has changed. Give her a lot of credit for identifying what it needed to be done and making the right hire in Mark Byington and getting him in the building.
Another thing too, and I gotta wrap us up because we got an out based off what Zoom is telling us. But I think a thing that we had talked about during the hiring process, but haven't talked about it a ton, is how they've supported him. And I think he's had a lot of support. I think the collective has been really helpful to them. I think the facility's been really helpful to them. They're in it now. They've been in it for a couple weeks. That's all stuff to note. They went in there, I think the week or the day before they went to Charleston was the first time they used the practice facility. So they've been in it. There's a lot to note and a lot of really good things for this program at the moment. I think another thing too, the collective is trying to sign these guys beyond this year, and they're trying to work out stuff to be able to get them down the line. That's something that will help them too. And then I think they have enough resources and enough talent identification to where they can go get a transfer class that excites people. Their high school recruiting hasn't really amounted to much so far, but I think they have a lot going for them in terms of their program infrastructure and how this thing has been built. And I think whatever happens in SEC play, which we don't know yet, it could be great, could be terrible. And I'll flip it to you for a prediction in a second before we get off. I'll give you a little heads up as to what you're thinking the win mark actually looks like. But there's a lot going for this program right now, and it'll be interesting to see if they can carry it into SEC play. Brandon, give me your prediction for what it looks like. You thought you were getting away from that, didn't you?
I know you, Joey. I knew I wasn't going to get out scot free on that one. But, just kind of looking at really what this Vanderbilt team is, how they've looked, the schedule. I'm gonna go ahead and say that they go 7-9. I think 7-9 probably is a pretty good benchmark for this team. I mean, this is a team that though does have its flaws within the way that the SEC is played. I do have some concerns about the front court depth and about the interior, and those are things that I just don't know are necessarily going to change because I feel like a lot of it is just kind of roster makeup more than it is just certain things they're doing. But I also do think that there are little things they can do that kind of help mitigate that. I mean, you mentioned guards crashing the glass and trying to do what they can to kind of pitch in and help guys like McLaughlin and Carey clean up the glass. I do think that things like that can maybe help them a little bit. But I also think there's a lot of things this team does well. They're one of the most efficient teams in the country. They're actually top 16 in effective efficiency coming into the day. And they also are a team that, as you mentioned, don't turn the ball over much. They get a lot of possessions, which can really help you in the SEC. And a lot of their games that they have at home are pretty big games. You look at South Carolina, that's a home game. They have Tennessee and Kentucky at home. They have Texas and Auburn at home, which will be two very tough games. Ole Miss, that will be a game that's going to be a big one. So a lot of their tougher opponents they play at Memorial Gym. And Joe, I know you've been kind of the stat guy today, but I'm going to add one in myself. Something that no one's really talked about is that people are showing up to Vanderbilt games again. And I'm looking at it now. 5,011 people showed up for the opener. At the end of the season for non-conference against New Orleans, that was 7,302. And those two teams that they played are pretty comparable in Maryland, Eastern Shore, and New Orleans. So people are buying into this program again. People are excited to watch this team play. And with the stakes being higher and this team galvanizing a lot of that genuine excitement in Memorial Gym again, and with these games having so much potentially on the line, I think it's pretty safe to say that that's going to be in the 5-digit mark in just a couple of weeks. So I think that Vanderbilt will get 7 wins. I think that should be enough to at least put them firmly in the bubble conversation. And then if they win an SEC tournament game, should be enough to get them in what they've done up to this point.
Interesting you bring that up because I do think the attendance has gotten better. You know better than me. You've been there the last couple of games, but I'm interested to see what it's like on Tuesday. I think that's going to be a real benchmark for them to see what it's like at the beginning of SEC play versus the end. It feels like people care again. It feels like people know the players again. People are understanding kind of what they're doing again. They're seeing the vision that Mark Byington has more so than they have seen with a couple previous coaches. Brandon, I think that is a real thing that they can hang their hat on at this point. I had them in the 5 to 8 win margin. Ken Palm had them at 7-11. I think that's kind of where I would lean. Last year they won four with that team, and we talk about it being a gauntlet, but if you take it game by game and you think they've got to have a chance in a lot of these games. There's not a perfect team in the league. There's a lot of really good teams that are better than them, but they can beat a lot of these teams. I think their style is going to allow them to beat some teams they shouldn't. And they actually, we talked about in the preseason, they're going to lose to a team probably that they shouldn't, and they're going to beat some teams they shouldn't because of the style. They beat every team they should, except for maybe Drake, but it's a really good team itself. I'm gonna have them at 7 as well. I think that's probably a good middle ground of sorts. And last year I said 2, so maybe they'll exceed it again. But it's just a testament to where they're at this point versus where they were at last year. The league is harder, and we're still predicting them to get 3 more wins than they did last year. So the talent level is up, and things are rolling as it stands on West End. There's a lot that's yet to be played out. This could be going in the dumpster in 2 weeks, considering they're going to start to run the gauntlet at that point if they don't do well in the first four. But Brandon, for now, a lot of good things to talk about with Vanderbilt hoops. We'll continue to do it at Vanderbilt 24/7 on the podcast here. Go on the site, go on the board. The board is popping right now, Brandon. I'm sure you've seen it, but
Oh, yeah.
I feel like a salesman for the first time in my life rather than just an analyst. But we really believe in what we're doing over there, and make sure to join us if you haven't. So thank you guys for watching. God bless. And Brandon, I will be. I think the next time we'll be together is Tuesday against Mississippi State at Memorial, and me and maybe somebody else, or maybe just me, will have the rapid reaction on Saturday, and we'll talk to you then. Thank you guys for watching. God bless. Peace.